Dear girls, there comes a moment in every woman's life when the silence speaks louder than the chase, when the absence of his presence no longer feels like a loss, but a breakthrough. That was her moment. The day she stopped chasing him wasn't a defeat. It was a declaration. She realized she had spent too much time editing herself to fit into a story that was never hers to begin with. She had dimmed her light so someone else could shine. She had rewritten her identity, page by page, trying to be lovable in the eyes of a man who couldn't even recognize the rare soul standing in front of him. But that day, the day she stopped chasing, wasn't a day of heartbreak. It was the first day of her becoming. She stopped waiting on texts that never came. She stopped begging for attention, affection, validation. She closed the chapter with no dramatic goodbyes. She just stopped. She started walking back to herself. With every step away from him, she stepped into her own power. She began to listen to her own voice, not the one that whispered self-doubt, but the one that roared with dreams she had buried for far too long. She began building. Brick by brick, she constructed the version of herself she had abandoned while chasing someone who didn't deserve her energy. She picked up her ambition, wiped the dust off, and wore it proudly. She invested in her peace, her growth, her vision. No, it wasn't easy. Growth never is. There were days she cried, nights she doubted, and moments she almost ran back. But she didn't, because the woman she was becoming was far too valuable to trade for a man who couldn't see her worth. She started waking up with purpose. She built routines, chased passions, learned to love her own company. She danced alone, traveled solo, made plans without consulting anyone but her heart, and the irony. The moment she became whole on her own, the world started chasing her, not because she was available, but because she was undeniable. See, a woman who creates herself after destruction is unstoppable. When she chooses herself over crumbs, when she turns silence into strength, when she finds beauty in her solitude, she becomes a force. So, if you've been chasing someone who keeps running, stop. Not because you're not good enough, but because you are more than enough, and you don't need to prove it. Create yourself, build your own table, write your own rules, define your own beauty, and celebrate every inch of your becoming. The day she stopped chasing him, she didn't lose love. She found herself, and that was the beginning of everything. Choosing yourself is not selfish, it's survival. The moment she stopped chasing someone who didn't see her worth, she chose herself for the first time, and that decision became the foundation of her rebirth. Reclaiming energy is reclaiming power. Every ounce of energy she once gave to chasing him was redirected into building herself, her dreams, and her peace. Silence can be the loudest statement. She didn't need to shout, explain, or beg. Walking away in silence was her loudest act of self-respect and liberation. Growth is born in the uncomfortable. Her transformation wasn't born in ease. It was forged through discomfort, pain, and the courage to stay when it hurt and rebuild anyway. Wholeness attracts, not neediness. When she became complete on her own, she stopped chasing. And ironically, that's when everything and everyone started gravitating toward her. Her story was never about him. It was always about her becoming. The real journey was never about a man. It was about her evolution into the woman she was always meant to be, and the masterpiece she was destined to create. The moment she stopped chasing someone who couldn't see her worth, something inside her shifted. It was quiet, almost unnoticeable at first. A subtle release, like exhaling after holding her breath for too long. She had spent so much time waiting, hoping, molding herself into something more likable, more lovable, more acceptable. She twisted her personality, shrank her dreams, and stretched her heart past its limit, just to be enough for someone who barely looked up. And in that exhausting pursuit, she forgot herself. But one day, she simply stopped. Not out of anger, not from resentment, but because she finally realized what it was costing her to keep trying. It wasn't just about not being chosen, it was about her not choosing herself. She understood that every time she chased, she gave a piece of herself away. Her confidence, her peace, her time, her value. They were all being placed in the hands of someone who didn't know what to do with them. Choosing herself didn't come with fanfare. There was no announcement. She didn't scream, block, or curse. She just let go, and in that release, she didn't fall apart. She rose. For the first time in a long time, she asked herself what she wanted, what made her feel alive, safe, inspired. She stopped asking how she could be better for someone else and started asking how she could be better for herself. That shift was everything. She began waking up differently, no longer checking for messages that didn't come or signs that someone missed her. Instead, she checked in with herself. She took herself on walks. She began learning new things, not to impress anyone, but to feed her soul. She started dressing for herself, speaking for herself, standing up for herself. Each small act was a vote in her favor. She realized that choosing herself was not selfish. It was necessary. It was survival. And no, it wasn't easy. The habit of self-sacrifice ran deep. There were days when the loneliness felt heavy and unfamiliar, but she didn't run back. She reminded herself that being alone was not the same as being unworthy, that someone's inability to value her didn't make her any less valuable. Slowly, her silence became her power. She no longer needed to be seen to know she was radiant. She no longer needed to be held to know she was whole. As time passed, she stopped wondering where he was, what he was doing, or if he missed her, because she was too busy discovering new pieces of herself. She started dreaming again, boldly. She took up space. She laughed without apology. She glowed without permission. The same woman who once begged for attention was now too busy building her empire to care who was watching. And the world noticed. People started gravitating toward her light, not because she was chasing, but because she was choosing herself unapologetically. The tables turned, not because she played the game better, but because she walked away from it entirely. She was no longer trying to prove her worth to anyone. Her life became proof enough. That was the day everything changed, not the day he left, not the day he didn't call back, but the day she stopped chasing. That was the day she remembered who she was, and that choice to walk away from what wasn't choosing her became the most powerful beginning of her life, because in choosing herself, she didn't just take a new path. She created it. Every ounce of energy she once poured into chasing him was energy she could have been pouring into herself. And the moment she realized that, everything changed. Energy is not limitless, and for too long, she had been draining hers in an emotional marathon that led nowhere. She replayed conversations in her mind, analyzed his every word, waited for the bare minimum and celebrated it like it was gold. She gave him her mornings, her midnights, her mental clarity, and even her peace. All of it was wrapped around the hope that one day, maybe, he would finally see her, really see her. But what she didn't realize back then was that her energy was her power. Every text she waited for, every call she initiated, every plan she made around him, that was energy being misdirected. She wasn't building her life, she was building castles in the air with someone who had no intention of staying, and it cost her. It cost her time, self, worth, joy, and more than anything, it cost her the version of herself she could have become if only she had turned that energy inward. When she finally stopped chasing, when she redirected that focus, something magical happened. She started to glow, not because someone finally adored her, but because she began adoring herself. She took all the emotional effort she used to waste on wondering, worrying, doubting, and redirected it into creating boundaries, creating goals, creating a life she didn't need to escape from. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but with each decision to prioritize her peace, she reclaimed her strength. She started pouring energy into her passions. the things that made her feel alive, the things she had once put on hold because she was too emotionally distracted to pursue them. She started working on her fitness, not to impress anyone, but to feel strong in her own skin. She began reading again, learning again, dreaming again. She remembered her love for art, music, writing, things that had always brought her joy but had been lost in the noise of trying to be loved by someone else. What's powerful is that when she made this shift, it didn't just change how she felt, it changed how the world responded to her. She wasn't begging to be chosen anymore. She had already chosen herself. Her energy became magnetic, not because she was trying to be seen, but because her authenticity made her impossible to ignore. There was a new fire in her eyes, a groundedness in her spirit, a quiet confidence that said, "I know who I am, and I don't need your validation." She started living with intention, no longer running on emotional autopilot. She protected her time, her mental health, her space. She became selective, not out of arrogance, but out of self-respect. She understood now that whoever wanted to be in her life had to bring peace, not confusion. Contribution, not chaos, and most of all, they had to meet her where she stood, not somewhere behind her, hoping she'd shrink again. That's the thing about energy, it's always flowing somewhere. The day she decided to direct it back to herself was the day she started creating a life that reflected her true worth. And now, she doesn't chase. She attracts because she finally realized that the most powerful thing she could ever do wasn't to convince someone to choose her, but to invest everything she had into choosing herself. She didn't shout. She didn't explain. She didn't slam doors or demand closure. She just stopped, and in that silence she made the loudest statement of her life. There's something incredibly powerful about a woman who no longer needs to be heard to feel seen. She had chased, begged, pleaded with the universe to make him love her the way she deserved. But on the day she fell silent, she reclaimed her dignity. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was authority. It was her final answer without saying a single word. For a long time she had thought that expression equaled power, that if she could just explain herself better, cry harder, argue stronger, maybe he'd understand, maybe he'd care. But there's a point where words become useless. When someone has already made up their mind about your worth, no sentence, no message, no perfectly timed tear will change it. So she stopped trying to be understood and started choosing peace. That quiet eggs, it didn't mean she didn't hurt. Of course she did. She had invested parts of herself into someone who didn't know how to value what he was given. Her heart was broken, not because of the silence, but because of everything she had tolerated before it. But still, she didn't turn back. She had learned that sometimes the most empowering thing a woman can do is walk away without drama. Her silence wasn't passive, it was intentional, it was the boundary. It was the line between her past and the woman she was about to become. What the world often misunderstands is that silence doesn't mean weakness. It doesn't mean she gave up. In fact, she had never been stronger. It takes immense courage to walk away without needing applause, to leave without needing someone to know how much they hurt you, to heal privately. That kind of strength isn't loud, it's rooted, it's steady. It's unshakable. With each quiet morning she spent alone, she began to feel the beauty of her own presence. No noise, no chaos, no explanations. Just her, breathing, existing, healing. She started journaling, not for anyone else's eyes, but for her own. She poured out years of unspoken thoughts onto paper and let them bleed there instead of in her heart. She cooked for herself, danced in her room, laughed at old memories, cried when she needed to, and not once did she feel the need to text him. That was the difference now. Before, she needed him to feel something so she could feel complete, but now her silence was filled with self-connection. She didn't need revenge or a comeback or even a conversation. Her absence was the answer. Her healing was the loudest truth, and eventually the world noticed. Maybe he noticed, but by then it didn't matter, because her silence wasn't for him. It was for her. She didn't need to make noise to prove she had changed. Her life did that for her, her peace, her glow, her refusal to entertain what didn't serve her anymore. All of it spoke volumes. She didn't break the silence with a text. She broke the cycle with a choice. The choice to stay silent, to stay grounded, to stay free, and in that silence she found clarity, she found strength, and most importantly, she found herself. Her growth didn't come wrapped in motivation or drenched in positivity. It came through nights that felt endless, tears that stained her pillow, and mornings where getting out of bed felt like lifting the weight of the world. Growth, for her, wasn't a beautifully edited montage with music playing in the background. It was raw, it was real, and it was uncomfortable, but that discomfort became the soil in which she planted herself anew. When she let go of chasing him, she stepped into a space she wasn't used to silence. Solitude, stillness, it was unsettling at first. The silence forced her to hear things she'd been running from, her fears, her insecurities, her inner critic whispering, "You weren't enough." But instead of running this time, she sat with it. She listened, she questioned, and slowly she began to separate her worth from someone else's rejection. She had spent so long attaching her value to how much love she could give, even when it wasn't reciprocated. She believed the more she poured, the more she'd be loved back. But what she came to realize during her most painful moments was that love isn't proven by how much you can endure. True love doesn't require you to shrink, to suffer, or to break just to be accepted. Growth taught her that loving someone else at the expense of herself was not noble. It was self-abandonment. There were days she questioned everything, days when she almost ran back, not because she missed him, but because the healing felt unbearable. But healing is not meant to be easy. It's meant to change you, to strip away what was never yours, to burn away the lies you believed about yourself. And that fire, it's brutal. It burns your illusions. It scorches your fantasies, but it also clears the space for truth. And in that truth, she finally began to bloom. She started doing the work, the real work, not the kind that looks pretty on social media. The kind that no one claps for. She faced her wounds. She admitted the parts of her that were still hurting. She took responsibility for the times she betrayed her own heart in hopes of being chosen. She stopped numbing herself with distractions and faced her reflection with honesty, even when it was hard to look at. That's when the shift happened, not all at once, but moment by moment. She became more self-aware, more intentional, and more fearless. What once felt like rejection slowly transformed into redirection. The pain that nearly broke her became the force that built her. She started valuing her boundaries, her intuition, her time. She stopped explaining herself to people who never really listened. She stopped shrinking so others could feel comfortable. She stopped chasing anyone who didn't run beside her. Growth didn't feel like strength at first. It felt like survival. But through the discomfort, she discovered resilience she didn't know she had. And that resilience became her armor. Her past was no longer her prison, it became her platform. She learned that every version of herself, even the broken one, was worthy of compassion, and that self-compassion. That became her power, so no, growth wasn't comfortable. It tore her apart before it put her back together, but when it did, she rose taller, stronger, clearer, and she didn't need anyone else to see it. Because this time, she wasn't growing for him. She was growing for herself. She used to believe that love meant needing someone, craving their presence, depending on their words to feel beautiful, worthy, or safe. She thought wholeness came from being held, from being seen through someone else's eyes. But when she stopped chasing him and began creating herself, she discovered something more powerful than love from another. She discovered love from within. And that changed everything. There was a time when she thought being wanted was the highest form of validation, that someone choosing her meant she was finally enough. So she tried harder. She overgave, overcompensated, and overextended herself just to be seen. But the more she gave, the more invisible she became. And the truth is, you can't force someone to value you by emptying yourself. That kind of neediness doesn't bring love closer, it pushes it away. It wasn't until she stopped chasing and turned her focus inward that she realized her true worth had nothing to do with being needed. It had everything to do with being whole. When she began nurturing her own heart instead of waiting for someone to save it, she tapped into a power she never knew she had. Wholeness doesn't beg, wholeness doesn't cling, wholeness doesn't chase, it attracts. She stopped trying to prove herself. She stopped twisting into different versions to fit into someone else's world. She began to build her own. She started waking up not to check her phone for his message, but to check in with herself. She made plans that didn't revolve around him, dreams that didn't rely on anyone's permission, and choices that finally prioritized her own joy. There was something magnetic about that shift, something unexplainable. The same woman who once waited anxiously for validation was now glowing with self-respect. The same woman who once tolerated mixed signals and crumbs of attention was now walking away from anything that didn't serve her peace. And without even trying, people began to notice. Opportunities came knocking, connections deepened, the world began to reflect the value she saw in herself. But the irony, by the time the world started chasing her, she no longer needed it to. She was no longer seeking completion from external things. She had become her own home, her own peace, her own validation. She learned that love, when it's real, doesn't come from need, it comes from overflow. From two whole people choosing each other without trying to fill a void. She no longer chased anyone because she had stopped running from herself. And when you stop running from who you are, the need to be seen, validated, or loved from the outside starts to fade. She had filled the gaps inside her with strength, awareness, and grace. She had built herself up so solidly that she didn't fear being alone, because alone no longer meant empty, it meant free. She became someone who attracted, not out of desperation, but out of alignment. People were drawn to her not because she begged for attention, but because she radiated certainty, confidence, calm. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. Her energy did that for her. That's what happens when you stop chasing and start creating. You realize your wholeness was never dependent on someone else. It was buried underneath all the noise, all the doubt, all the fear. And when she finally met that version of herself, the full, unapologetic, powerful version, she understood that being whole was the real love story all along. The truth is, it was never about him, not really, it was always about her, who she would become through the pain, through the silence, through the rebuilding. For so long, she made him the center of her story. His attention, his affection, his decisions determined her happiness. She measured her value based on how close or distant he felt. But the moment she stopped chasing him, the lens shifted, and she saw clearly that this entire time, the journey wasn't about winning someone's love. It was about reclaiming her own. She thought the heartbreak would break her, that losing him meant losing her future, but as the dust settled, something unexpected happened. She didn't collapse, she rose. Slowly, quietly, but she rose, because buried beneath all that chasing and pleasing was a woman waiting to be discovered, a woman who didn't just survive abandonment, she transformed because of it. The things she once saw as failures, him leaving, the unanswered messages, the emotional distance, were never signs of her not being enough. They were simply detours to lead her back to herself. That was the story all along. Not the one about love that didn't last, but about the woman who finally realized she didn't need someone else to make her feel complete. She was already complete. She just had to remember. She began asking deeper questions. Not about what went wrong with him, but about what she had ignored within herself. Why did she tolerate so little? Why did she keep giving chances when the signs were so loud? Why was she afraid of being alone? And as she answered those questions, layer by layer, she peeled back everything that wasn't truly hers, every belief that told her she wasn't worthy without someone beside her, and in that unraveling, she met the most authentic version of herself. The one who didn't settle for crumbs, the one who wasn't afraid to speak up, walk away, or stand alone, the one who loved deeply but didn't abandon herself for anyone, that version had always been there. Waiting, watching, silenced, but now she was finally free. She started building a life that didn't require anyone else to complete it. Her mornings were filled with purpose, not waiting. Her evenings were peaceful, not anxious. She poured herself into her goals, her passions, her healing. She found joy in solitude. She found power in independence. She found clarity in boundaries. And most of all, she found pride in her progress. No one applauded when she cried herself to sleep and still showed up the next day. No one saw the internal battles she fought to let go of something that once felt like everything, but she saw it, she lived it. And now she wears that growth like armor. When he walked away, she thought the story was over, but it had only just begun, because the most beautiful part wasn't the love she lost. It was the woman she found. The woman who no longer needed to be chosen because she had already chosen herself. And now she doesn't chase. She doesn't beg. She doesn't wait. Because the story is hers to write. And she's writing it in bold, brilliant, unstoppable lines.